So I was playing Resident Evil 8 recently, and there were two things I couldn't stop thinking about. One of them being Lady Dimitrescu.
This one goes straight to horny jail. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. You're done, sir. And now I'm done.
The other thing is that ending. Where the heck do we go from here? The ending for Resident Evil 8 leaves way too many questions, so I felt like talking about it. So we're gonna talk about Resident Evil's biggest problem right now, where I think they could go for Resident Evil 9, and some leaks that are pretty interesting and might be what the game ends up being. So spoilers for Resident Evil 8 if you haven't beaten it. You might want to do that and then come back and watch this. Also, if you haven't played it, go play it. It's pretty damn good. So the biggest problem Resident Evil has right now, and it's one that I honestly wasn't thinking about all that much until I started playing Resident Evil 8 and I saw just how Chris looks in it. The classic characters are getting older. Because when you think about it, the original game takes place in 1998. Village takes place sometime in 2020. That's 22 years. And I'm pretty sure Chris was probably in his 20s during the first game, so by now, he's in his 40s. Probably pushing mid-40s or getting closer to 50, to be honest with you. I remember seeing some concept art for Chris, how he was supposed to look in the game. He might have actually ended up looking even older than he does. And if the series keeps going, eventually characters like Chris and Leon and the old gang, they're gonna be too old for this shit. And I think Capcom is aware of that, which is why I think they might have, that probably partially influenced the idea of having a brand new character for 7 and 8, which is Ethan, on top of wanting a new character that wasn't a trained soldier or a police officer and things like that, or a secret agent, to try and make 7 scarier by having it be an everyman type character. And that could also explain why Chris only shows up at the end and then gets a DLC later on that's like an epilogue to the main game, because they wanted you to play as pretty much a normal guy to make the game scarier. But now Ethan is dead. Well, maybe. There is that thing at the end of the game where in the scene when Rose gets in the car, there's someone walking beside it. And if you do hack the game, you can see that it is Ethan's model. Depending on how you want to look at that, that could mean that Ethan is alive. Or it could be a symbolic thing like he's always with her or something. Or it could simply be they wanted to have a model beside the car and they didn't want to make a brand new model for that. So they just reused Ethan's and you wouldn't be able to see it normally anyway to know it was him. Make of that as you will. Though, since Rose is basically Evelyn, I wonder if Rose could use her powers to somehow bring Ethan back or make a mold clone of him. Who knows, they might actually bring him back. I think that would cheapen his death at the end of Resident Evil 8 to do that. And the last line you see at the end of the game, which is the father's story is now done. So I think bringing him back again would just undo all of that and wouldn't be a good idea. But they did say that metamycete thing does contain the consciousness of anyone it absorbs, and since Ethan was absorbed by it, since his whole body was replaced with mold after Jack killed him in the opening of Resident Evil 7, it's not impossible for him to come back in some capacity. I think Capcom is probably going to leave him dead though. But going back to the character problem, Resident Evil Time did introduce new characters that had supporting roles in games or only appeared in one game and then were never mentioned again. And if they really want to keep the series going after they have to retire the older characters just because they'd be too old, I think they should use some of those. Because some of those characters were younger, so you wouldn't have to worry about the aging problem again for a while. Sherry comes to mind. I think she was in her 20s in Resident Evil 6, so you could have her come back for multiple games as the main character. And I think it'd be fun. It'd be cool to see that. Hell, I think it'd be cool to have her and Leon working together on some kind of outbreak. Even if it was a spinoff or something, that'd be neat. We also still have Zoe from Resident Evil 7, and she does cameo on a file in the game's menu about what happened after 7, so she's still out there. Hell, they could use Zoe as a protagonist for the next game. She could have been toughening up, learning some survival tricks. Well, she probably already knew some survival tricks. I mean, redneck. You know what I mean? She could be more skilled with guns and stuff at that point. Hell, she could even flex that redneck ingenuity, especially with the crafting system. If they keep that from 7 and 8, I can see them expand that even more and having her create all kinds of crazy shit, like traps and stuff maybe. Another character they could bring back is Rebecca, because she hasn't been in a game since Resident Evil 0, and the last time we saw her in the timeline, is Resident Evil Vendetta, where she works at a college and it takes place a little bit before 7. So for lack of a better term, I think you could get some mileage out of her and not worry about her getting too old for a while and having her be as a main character or come back for 1 or 2 games or something. Although there was that rumor, and I haven't heard anything about it since, but there was going to be some kind of Nintendo Switch spinoff called, I think it was called Resident Evil Outrage, that was supposed to have her in it. I wonder what's going on with that. The other thing that, you know what, I'm just going to address it because this always bugs the hell out of me. Where the hell is Jill? She's been missing since Resident Evil 5 and it's weird. No one even mentions Jill either. In the entirety of Resident Evil 6, Chris doesn't mention Jill once. He mentions Claire at one point, but that's about it. She's not even mentioned in 7's DLC at all, or in the brief bit where you play as Chris in 8 either. Does she work with the BSA anymore? Is she retired? What's going on? It feels really weird that one of the first protagonists in Resident Evil has been missing for so long. And I'm not counting Resident Evil 3 Remake, since that's a remake of 3, which is not in the present day at all. It's almost like everyone in the Resident Evil universe was thrown into a genjutsu where Jill doesn't exist. Todd, what the fuck is a genjutsu? It's a technique in Naruto that makes you suffer from sensory illusions. Okay, all I got of that was weeb shit, so we're moving on. I know Jill is probably in the same boat as Chris with the whole getting too old for this shit, but still. It's so weird that she pretty much doesn't exist post Resident Evil 5. Claire is in a somewhat similar boat since we haven't seen her since Revelations 2, which took place around the time of Resident Evil 6. Speaking of Claire, Chris might want to hurry up because the Redfield bloodline must continue and Claire's running out of time. You got to find somebody for that or try Leon again. Speaking of Revelations 2, now that I think about it, Moira's a character that's young enough that she could be used for future games. But going back to my main point, if they don't end the series soon, at least the main series anyway, we're gonna have to say goodbye to the old crew at some point. As much as I don't want to, because Leon is my favorite character, they're gonna have to do that if they want to keep this going. But let's talk about where they can go from here. Do you like sci-fi? Do you like superhero teams? Well, you might want to check out my book, Renegades Volume 1 Rise, now available on Amazon, both physical and digital. Set in the far future, humanity accidentally crossed over into another dimension while trying to escape a dying Earth. They arrived at a mirror Earth called Terra, inhabited by sentient humanoid animals called Terrans. Humans and Terrans coexisted for a little while, but they eventually went to war. After 10 years of brutal warfare, they eventually found peace. Our story is set 50 years later. A madman named Ivan and his terror cell called Scythe are searching for a dangerous weapon that will allow them to take over the world. The only people who can stop them are the Renegades, a ragtag group of misfits including a teenage girl trained to be a soldier since she was a child, a teenage delinquent with a hoverboard, 2 super geniuses, a former heavyweight pro boxer with cybernetic augments, and a mysterious blue creature with no memories and the ability to manipulate water and ice. In order to stop Ivan, the Renegades will have to take on giant mechs, evil mega corporations, terrorists, cyborg ninjas, and more in their exciting debut. You can pick up the digital version for 99 cents or the print version for 17 bucks. You can also read the book for free as serials on my Wattpad and Minds accounts. They are updated every other week with a new section. I noticed that there's a pattern with Resident Evil, and I doubt this was intentional, at least initially, but it's there anyway. The numbered entries are broken into trilogies when you think about it in terms of gameplay style. 1 through 3 is a survival horror trilogy. Yeah, you can lump Code Veronica in there, even though, again, it's not a numbered entry, but Veronica seems like the game that just doesn't get that much attention. I mean, the other leaks are true. 4 is getting a remake, but Veronica isn't. I think Veronica needs a remake more than 4, even though I'm not against a 4 remake, but that's a whole other can of worms. But for the sake of my point, we're just looking at the numbered entries, so 1 through 3 is a survival horror trilogy with the tank controls and the fixed camera angles, you know, the classics. Then we got 4, which kicked off the action trilogy. 4 was probably the best mix of action and horror, but as it went on, the action took over more and more. Now we're in the FPS survival horror age, which I think we're probably going to get one final game in the first-person style. But the problem is Resident Evil 8's honestly surprising ending, I did not expect that, throws a monkey wrench into things, because I highly doubt they're going to just bring Ethan back, because they went through way too much effort of killing him off at the end of 8. They put way too much time and effort and emotional stuff into that to have him just come back. And there's another problem with the ending of 8, and that's the timeline issue. Because in that game, we see Rose, and she looks like she's at least 18 at the youngest. Does she age normally? Because now that means we're 18 years later, and Chris is probably going on 60 years old if he's not already there. So that exacerbates the aging problem even more. Unless she ages fast like Evelyn and it's really only been like 3 or 4 years. But that would be kind of unfortunate considering what happens when Evelyn didn't take her meds and she went grandma mode. That's something I guess they're gonna have to address in 9 or some DLC. And outside of that, there's so many plot points that have not been addressed, some of them raised by 8's ending, that they're either going to have to address in DLC or save them for 9. And I'm going to talk about the most obvious ones that we really do need some fucking answers to. What's going on with the BSAA? Because it sounds like Chris and the BSAA aren't on good terms anymore, since they're using BOW soldiers at the end of Resident Evil 8. And part of the ending was Chris saying that they need to go to BSAA's Europe HQ. So I'm assuming Chris confronted them on that, because if I remember correctly, Chris helped found the organization, so he is beyond pissed right now.
I started this company. You know how much I sacrificed?
It sounds like the BSAA is compromised, and Capcom did announce recently that we are getting DLC for 8, and part of me feels like they're going to address some of that there since Chris did have DLC in the last game, but there really wasn't a whole much to that outside of just killing Lucas. And we didn't learn all that much, so maybe the DLC will follow like the same pattern and end up raising more questions than it answers. I hope that's not the case, but they might end up doing that. Because the whole BSAA plotline feels like something that they would save for the next installment, not just wrap it up in DLC. This is something that I'll admit is probably not going to happen, but I wish it would. And that they reveal that Albert Wesker is alive and somehow infiltrated the BSAA. Like Hydra did to S.H.I.E.L.D. and Captain America with a soldier. Because I think killing Wesker was a big mistake, and part of me wishes he was a central villain again, or that we had a central villain. But most likely though, it's going to be the connections has compromised BSA, which feels like the logical thing they're going to do. But that's another thing that they really need to address, because we still don't know that much about them, and the only new things we learned are from a file that I doubt most people found looking in like the bonus menu. So, and that info that's in that file isn't conveyed in the actual story of the game, in the gameplay or whatever, or cutscenes. We do have a name attached to him now, which is Progress, a guy named Brandon Bailey, who was one of the founders of Umbrella. And we also learned that they did reach out to Miranda, and Miranda was working with them to create Evelyn. We also know that they most likely told Miranda about Rose, which leads me to believe they've got people in the BSAA and probably have some control over it. So I'm wondering if the DLC is going to bring them up and show them in some capacity, since they've been in the shadow for the last 2 games at this point. And I think it's time that they do something out in the open. But part of me feels like they're going to save that for 9. And that would be a good way to cap off this trilogy of games, assuming that we're still treating this as a trilogy. Which I believe they are, because I remember there being an interview where they highlighted how the previous 2 trilogies had the same gameplay style. So I think they are going to treat this one, 9, as that. Also, it seems like they just dropped the whole Blue Umbrella thing outside of the med injector in Resident Evil 8 that you used during Chris's section of the game. They're not mentioned. Are these guys evil or are they actually good? Because I don't know. Until the reveal that the BSA is using bioweapons, I was under the impression that Blue Umbrella was a front for the connections and that they were releasing bioweapons to then contain and kill them to make themselves look good in the public. And it would also allow them to conduct research on these BOWs and say that, oh, it's to help combat future outbreaks so we can figure out how to better stop these things. But what they're actually doing is collecting combat data and figuring out how to make their creations better so they can sell them on the black market. Like, that sounds like the perfect scheme, the perfect underhanded thing to do. And I still think that it's plausible that's what they're doing. But with the BSAA now looking shady, I'm not so sure about that. And it's weird that Blue Umbrella has been effectively dropped from the plot too, outside of that cameo with the injector thing. I have an idea, and this is based off, if you look at Resident Evil 8's concept art, Ada was at some point supposed to show up in the game, but it got cut. What if the DLC for this game has her in it? What if she's working with Blue Umbrella to do something suspicious? I think that'd be really neat. But who would be the protagonist for Resident Evil 9? Because we know it's probably not going to be Ethan unless he comes back in some kind of cameo, flashback, or mold shenanigans. That's what I'm going to call him at this point, because the mold is getting fucking ridiculous with what it can do at this point. And in this Rose, I don't think Rose would work as at least not the main character, because it's implied that she is either just as powerful, if not more powerful than Evelyn. So putting her as a main character will remove any tension, in my opinion. Unless they did something like make her lose all of her powers somehow, which to me, you kind of blue ball in the audience if you say, oh yeah, you're going to play as sorry. You're going to play as Rose, but it's Rose without her powers. That's just kind of like, okay, what the fuck? What was the point in giving her powers then? So that would just be like what they did with Alice in the movies, where they had to strip her of her powers in the 4th movie because they realized after 3 that, yeah, she's too fucking ridiculous. I mean, she was still ridiculous after that, but you know what I mean. Maybe they'll do it in some kind of way where she loses control over her powers and she could be a threat for the next game, or part of the threat or something. I'm not sure how I'd feel about that either. So could Chris be the main character? It would make sense, but I think it would go against what they were trying to do with the previous 2 games by putting you in the shoes of the everyman type character. Although 8 goes back on that a bit with Ethan clearly undergoing training from Chris, even though logically it makes sense for him to do so. And that whole surprise twist with him being Mr. Mold Man who has regen powers. So I'm not sure if they really want to do that. Maybe they could split the game with 2 playable characters like they did with Resident Evil 2, where you play as Chris for half the game or a large section of it, and the other half is someone else. Mia's another option, since she didn't get to do all that much in 8 and she worked for the Connections. So if the Connections end up playing a big role in 9's story, like I think they will, having her be a major player in the story would make a lot of sense. And since she doesn't have any powers or special training as far as I know, she would fit the more down-to-earth, everyday person thrown into a horror situation vibe that they originally wanted to go with 7. And I could see her motivations being maybe the Connections have somehow kidnapped Rose or something, so she gets involved to find Rose. I think that could be interesting. Or it could just be Chris ask her for help with finding the Connections. Or they kidnap Mia and she gets free and there's some biohazard that's triggered and she has to find her way out or something. I don't know. And I already mentioned Zoe, so I'm gonna throw her head into the pile too. She could be trying to uncover the truth about what's really going on and stumble on something she shouldn't have and find herself in a fucked up situation. They could also use Zoe for DLC for 8. Then again, 7's DLC was really fucking weird. Like, there were some things that were more standard, and then there was shit that was just out there. Like, you had that Saw-esque poker game with Lucas, which was fun, don't get me wrong, but it was weird. Then you had the Marguerite Escape Room, which was, again, very odd, but fun and unexpected for DLC. I didn't like all the DLC, but I gotta commend them for trying some different things with it. And you had the Ethan Must Die DLC, which was brutal. 10. You're like healing items every time you die. And that was a trap. And I didn't check it.
Yeah, mostly because of the controls. I can't do that.
Let's put it this way. I have played Resident... Yo, he killed me in 1 hit.
I'm assuming that's either a good thing or a bad thing.
And I just died. When will we be able to buy Callous Master as a complete book?
Well, it's gonna be like, it's gonna be a comic,
fuck.
and
I can't get around him. So, maybe Resident Evil 8's DLC will be some weird experimental shit too. One thing that did weird me out with Resident Evil 8's story was at the beginning, you meet that one woman who it feels like she was gonna have a bigger role, because I remember they showed her in promotional stuff, and then she dies in a fire like 30 minutes in, and she's never brought up again. And I 100% expected her to come back, but she never did. I could see them doing some DLC where it's from her perspective and we get more context for things, or it sets up something for 9. I could definitely see them doing something like that. But let's move on to the alleged leaks about Resident Evil 9 because they're really interesting. Okay, before we get into these leaks,
disclaimer, these are leaks.
Assume they are not true until we get something official. That being said, Dust Golem has leaked things in the past that have been fairly accurate, if not 100% spot on, so make of that as you will. The leaked title, or at least the code name for 9, I don't know if this is the official title, is Apocalypse, and it's speculated to have a release date of 2024, so about 2 years at the time you're making this. And according to Dust Golem, this game has been in development since 2018, which if that's true, holy shit, that's a long time. Allegedly, they're going back to the third-person style, which throws a monkey wrench into what I was assuming they were going to do, but I can see why they would do it. There's supposed to be a partner system. There wasn't much info on that, but the document also says that this will be strictly single player, so no co-op like 5 and 6. I'm not sure how this partner system is gonna work. I guess it'll be like Revelations 2 where you just switch between characters, or characters can do one thing that another character can't. The setting is supposed to be in a ghost town, and creatures are meant to mimic old folktale monsters like Wendigos and Goatmen and things like that, which I won't lie, that sounds kind of neat. And it does fit what they did with 8 with the whole werewolves and witches, and Moreau was the mermaid or merman thing, even though very twisted version of that. That does make me wonder if they're still gonna have the mold be the bioweapon or the source of the monsters. Because 8 said that the village was the source of the mold, but that doesn't mean the Connections hasn't grown it somewhere else, like in a lab or released it in another location for testing. I'm thinking they're going to probably keep the mold, but maybe they'll add something new to it, like a modified strain, or they figure out how to make something out of it like that parasite Miranda was using to infect people in 8. And also, since those infected with mold hallucinate, that could help sell the whole folklore monster thing, and if they're gonna keep with the whole faux supernatural thing that they were doing with 8, that could play a part of it. Or who knows, maybe they'll completely pull the rug from under us and it's something completely new that we haven't seen before. Could be. The leak does say the atmosphere is going to try and evoke a more primordial fear of the unknown, and like the terror of being in like a deep forest, which, now that I say this aloud, I think we need more horror games set in forest, honestly. Because the last one I can think of is the Blair Witch game, which did not look that good, to be honest with you, because it's just like you were just walking around and the only creatures there, you would just shine a flashlight on them and they go away. It just didn't appeal to me. But I do think a game set in a forest, especially if it's first person, like that would be freaky as fuck. Because imagine like the atmosphere they could try to do with like you just hearing like the like the birds chirping or the sounds of like the trees swaying in the wind, and it's like at night and you're hearing twigs snapping and stuff, and you don't know if that's a monster or just part of the natural ambience in the woods. That could freak you the fuck out, especially if it's really pitch black and your light barely illuminates anything. You just see a monster just like moving between the trees, especially if the forest is really fucking dense. I'm getting a little freaked out thinking about that, honestly. There's also going to be some kind of, I'm just going to call it a paranoia mechanic where bioweapons can be hiding among your team of survivors. Like I guess there's some kind of creature that can imitate people. And that really gives me vibes of the old The Thing game on the PS2 and original Xbox. I'm not sure how that would work, but that could be really interesting. But the thing that does raise an eyebrow for me is that they're claiming this is the final chapter to finish the stories of the old characters. So this might not be the end of Resident Evil, but it would be the end of the old cast. So I guess this would be like the send-off for Leon, Jill, Claire, and others, I guess. Another article I found covering the leak says that those 4 characters are going to be the stars, which, nice. I want to see these characters come back, especially Jill. That does sound interesting, and I hope they do show up. I hope that part is legit. And switching back to third person is surprising, and I figured they were going to keep first person. But if they're having all the old characters returning, going with third person does make sense, since their games were third person, with the exception of Chris's little segments in 8. And I also remember when 8 was rumored that they were hoping that it was going to have third person, since the 2 and 3 remakes did so well with that style. I'm more used to third person with Resident Evil and I do prefer it, but I didn't have a problem with first person. I'm gonna link some articles talking about this, but I am gonna tell you, take this with a huge grain of salt. This could easily wind up being false. I'm not sure if I buy most of this. Although some of the leaks from 8 were pretty accurate, some of them not so much, so who knows. But to wrap this up, there is a lot of places they could honestly take Resident Evil 9. I'm not sure how I feel about everything in these leaks. A ghost town setting could be neat, and it kind of gives off some Silent Hill vibes, just from what I'm picturing in my head. I am worried about the aging thing, and I think if anything is true about this leak, is that they're going to give definitive conclusions for the previous characters. But I want to know what you guys think about this. If they do wrap up everything with the old cast and Resident Evil 9, should they keep making Resident Evil games after that? Should the series continue with a brand new cast of characters? Would you even keep playing after that? Part of me thinks the series should end once they've given the old characters their endings, for lack of a better term. Or if they do continue it has to be spin-offs. Because Capcom has some other franchises that they really don't use and need to bring back. Dino Crisis. Oh, sorry about that. Onimusha. I'm sorry, seasonal allergies are a bitch. I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of 9 being like the end for the old characters, but not necessarily the end for the whole series. Because I know there's a subset of people that did not like Ethan as a character and wanted the old cast back, so I'm wondering if they just flat out retire the old characters. If those people would even humor the idea of a Resident Evil 10 with all new characters. If they do get to 10, they need to just call it Resident Evil X and just call it a day. Like no subtitle, just Resident Evil X. But let me know what you guys think, what they should do with a 9th game.